Hey everybody, this is Pastor Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas, and you're watching ATP, Ask the Pastor. Hey, if this is your first time watching ATP, make sure and subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Also, check out all the goodies that we have in the video description below. Especially check out our searchable database since ATP has posted over 500 videos answering your questions. Let's get to today's question and add one more to that searchable database. Hello, Pastor. I wanted to ask if there's any valid reason to adopt the Julian calendar and not the Gregorian. Among the Eastern Orthodox, there are divisions because they see the use of the Julian calendar almost as a dogma. I've also seen that in Luther's time, the Julian calendar was still used and not the Gregorian. Is there any biblical reason or a church council or fathers of the church reason to use the Julian calendar so that Easter isn't celebrated at the same time as the Jewish Passover? All right, so first, what is the Julian calendar? Julian calendar was established by Julius Caesar in 45 BC to conform the Roman calendar to a solar year of 365 and a quarter days. And it would add an additional day in February every fourth year. Now, before Caesar's reform, the Roman calendar was a lunar calendar that required an additional month to be added every other year so that the calendar would continue to correspond to the seasons. Caesar also gave the names to the months and the lengths of the months, and the months received the number of days that we still use to this very day. The Julian calendar, it was the calendar of the Roman world until 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII promulgated a new calendar called the Gregorian calendar. Now, this is why Luther was on the Julian calendar. The Gregorian just didn't exist. So that's the reason why Luther didn't use it. The Julian calendar of 365 and a quarter days exceeds the average length of a true solar year. And so Renaissance astronomers, as they discovered this, estimated that the length of a solar year to be 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes, and 16 seconds long, or 365.2425463. So just a tiny bit shorter than Caesar's 365.25. Now, by Renaissance calculations, the vernal equinox recedes with respect to the calendar about 1 day every 134 years. So between the time of Julius Caesar and Gregory XIII, the Julian calendar was about 12 days off from the tropical year. By the middle of the 16th century, the true date of the vernal equinox then was March 11th rather than March 21st. So to prevent further drifting from the vernal equinox, the rule for leap years was revised. Instead of every fourth year being a leap year, century years wouldn't be leap years unless they were divisible by 400. Gregory then cut 10 days out of the month of October, and the Gregorian calendar was then in effect. Roman Catholic countries immediately began using the new calendar. Protestant territories did not. Protestant Germany and Switzerland didn't adopt their Gregorian calendar until 1700, and 52 years later, British Parliament introduced their Gregorian calendar for the United Kingdom and her colonies. Now, the Eastern Orthodox churches continued to use the Julian calendar until the Council of Constantinople in 1923. At this council, the revised Julian calendar, not the Gregorian, was adopted by the Church of Greece, the Church of Cyprus, the Romanian Orthodox Church, the Patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch, and then in 1968, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church adopted the revised Julian calendar. The Orthodox Church in America also uses the revised Julian. The revised Julian calendar corresponds with the Gregorian calendar until 2800, and it's even more accurate than the Gregorian. The Gregorian calendar is off by 27 seconds from the tropical year. The revised Julian calendar is only off by 2 seconds from the tropical year. And it accomplishes that precision with even more complex rules for determining leap years than the Gregorian calendar. Now, not all Eastern churches adopted the new calendar, though. So Russia, Georgia, Jerusalem, Sinai, and the monastery at Mount Athos did not. However, Those churches that still use the Julian calendar don't see the use of the new calendar as church dividing. And so they're still in communion with churches that have adopted the revised Julian calendar. The adoption of the new calendar, though, has caused a small rift in Eastern churches. Old calendarists are people who have separated from communion with the Orthodox churches in protest against the new calendar. Now, it's important to note that being old calendarist doesn't mean simply using the Julian calendar. It means having broken fellowship with the Eastern churches that have adopted the revised Julian calendar. So old calendarists refer to those who have accepted the revised Julian calendar as new calendarists. And they maintain that the revised Julian calendar is just basically the Gregorian calendar by another name. Old calendarists have severed communion with new calendarists because that they believe the calendar is a dogmatic issue. In fact, one old calendarist wrote, "Although the calendar is a human invention, its definitive acceptance by the Holy Orthodox Church elevates its status to the divine. Therefore, the violation of the calendar is a sin. And according to the ordinances of the ecumenical synods, it is a sin against the Holy Spirit who inspired these synods." For the old calendarists, the Julian calendar is part of the church's tradition, which they believe to be divinely inspired. To use any calendar other than the Julian calendar is therefore sinful. The only reason for accepting the new calendar, according to the old calendarist thinking, is the ecumenical desire to have union with the Roman Church. The entire calendar debate centers around the issue of Easter, how the Council of Nicaea specifically decreed the date of Easter needed to be computed. Now, we don't have any written decree from Nicaea about this, but based on a canon from the Council of Antioch in 331, it appears that Nicaea decided that the date of Easter is always the first Sunday after the full moon on or after the vernal equinox. So at the end of the second or the beginning of the 3rd century, Jewish authorities had established a new system for calculating the Passover that didn't take the equinox into account. This meant that once every 3 years, Passover occurred before the spring equinox. In this system, if only the equinox was taken into account, Easter could be celebrated twice in a 12-month period, or not at all from one equinox to another. Epiphanius, who died in 403, he notes that the church celebrates Easter after the equinox, quote, "to keep us from observing 2 Passovers in 1 year, and not even one in another," end quote. The apostolic constitutions, compiled in the second half of the 4th century, so late 300s, state, "Observe the days of the Passover exactly, with all care, after the vernal equinox, lest ye be obliged to keep the memorial of the Passion twice a year." And the apostolic canons, from around the same time, forbade celebrating Easter before the vernal equinox with the Jews. The chief disagreement between the old and the new calendarists is the meaning of what it means to celebrate Easter or the Pascha with the Jews. Old calendarists believe it means that Easter must not coincide with the Jewish celebration of Passover. New calendarists believe it means that Christians are not to compute the date of Easter using Jewish methods. Now, following the Julian calendar, Easter will continue to drift further away from the Jewish Passover over the course of time. And one of the reasons that the Gregorian reform was instituted of the calendar was to maintain some proximity between the two, since historically and theologically, Easter is linked with the Jewish Passover. As far as what calendar to use, the only reason for using the Julian calendar would be if the church you attend uses the Julian calendar. Now, Lutherans, being part of the Western Church, use the Western Church calendar. Now, while we don't use Jewish methods of calculating Easter, Neither do we insist that Easter ought never to be celebrated simultaneously as the Jewish Passover. Nor do we claim that ceremonies like the date of Easter must be uniform everywhere. The church's unity doesn't consist in in ceremonies like the date of Easter. It doesn't have to be uniform everywhere. The church's unity it consists of agreement in the gospel in all its articles and the right use of the sacraments. So when it comes to differences in ceremonies, Lutherans confess with Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote in the 3rd century about disagreements on the date of Easter. Disagreement in regard to the fast confirms agreement in the faith. Hope this helps with your calendrical question. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.